All right. So the next section, and this is the last section of today's class, is we're going to talk about barriers to discussing whiteness. We talked a little bit about this last class when we talked about common excuses that and how we avoid white fragility, how we avoid talking about, racism and white privilege and all the excuses that we give. But this section is actually going to focus on two specific ideas that are two major barriers to for us recognizing what whiteness is and white supremacy and racism and white privilege and all these things. One is white centering, and the other one is respectability politics. So we're going to kind of explore those two ideas throughout this section. Before we get started, I want to read this another just fantastic quote by James Baldwin. I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. I really like this a lot. Well, one, we need to recognize that a lot of most of the racism is our systems of racism, and they're not perpetuated by hate, but perpetuated by our history and a lot of different things. So you need to recognize that, but also these systems also do create a lot of hate. And I think it's important to also recognize, like I used to, that there are often things behind that hate. Real emotions, real things behind that. I used to work at this wilderness therapy camp where we take kids out and do a lot of interventions in the wilderness and a lot of therapeutic processing and things like that. And the big theme that we'd always come up with is like anger and hate. We would call them secondary emotions. They were oftentimes used to avoid really dealing with like the more primary emotions that you're dealing with, like hurt and pain and loss and shame, embarrassment, things like that. So a lot of times I think there are a lot of injustices in this world. It's really hard for to live in this world and not experience some kind of injustice. And some of these injustices are pretty awful. And so I think a lot of times instead of just looking at these bigger systems and looking at our history and kind of uncovering and exploring what's causing these actual injustices, a lot of times it's just so much easier just to hate. Just to believe these politicians that the reason why I can't pay my bills right now is because of a bunch of immigrants moving into my community, or believing that affirmative action is the reason I didn't get, into this college or into jail, or into some kind of job, and not that what's happening in our global market and the the accumulation of wealth to the 1% and all these other things. So it's just a lot of times we use this hatred as just it's just so much easier to feel that rather than to feel these bigger concepts. So I really value what James Baldwin says, and oftentimes we need to get beyond that and really experience not only work on ourselves but work on how the real realities that's causing us our pain. All right, but so good. Kind of jumping into, so first we're going to talk about white centering, and then like I said, we're going to talk about respectability politics on the other side of this. So white centering. I'm going to read this quote. Paulo Freire, I believe it's how you pronounce it. Apologize if it's a little bit off. He wrote a great book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a great book about not only working on decolonizing educational forms of decolonization, but also understanding things like popular education and different post-colonial ways to kind of to learn and to organize. But he wrote this this great quote called, it goes, "For the oppressors is this only one right, their right to live in peace over against the right not always even recognized but simply conceded of the oppressed to survival." Sorry. So what that's saying is for the oppressors, for the people on the top of the racial hierarchy, the biggest right that they're focused on is just their right to live in peace, their right to be comfortable with the world, their right to be okay and just enjoy and pursue their happiness, and that comes at a cost of the right of the people on the bottom of the hierarchy. at the right of their right to survive, their right to feel safety, their right not to experience racism. So because in racial hierarchies we put a lot more value on the oppressor's right to live in peace rather than dealing with the oppressed rights to survive. And that's what really what comes down what is behind this idea of white centering. So I'll read this quote from Jennifer Lobriel. Rather than focusing on lived experiences and traumas of people of color when talking about racism, the focus is placed on the host of emotions that white people go through when confronted with racism. Rather than focusing on how people of color feel on an everyday basis from having to deal with racist institutions, interpersonal relationships, and ideologies, the focus goes to white people just beginning to confront how they benefit from the racism on many levels. So a lot of white censoring is really about just focusing these experiences and these policies and these actions of racism instead of focusing on how they affect Black, Indigenous people of color. We're more focusing on how it affects white people and white feelings, kind of focusing conversations about racism around white feelings over Black feelings and experiences. And this can come out in a lot of different ways that white people react. White feelings such as anger, guilt, victimhood, need for comfort, need for safety. All these feelings are about, making this experience more about what white people are feeling. Now you have to deal with white people, now, we're having a conversation about race and racism, and all of a sudden we're having to deal with this angry white person, or all of a sudden this person, is feeling a lot of white guilt or victimhood, and we're now comforting them instead of dealing with that, the real cause, dealing with the racism of the conversation. And this comes out in a lot of different ways, a lot of white reactions, such as tone policing, derailing conversations, gaslighting, defensiveness, a lot of just dominating conversations, minimizing what they're saying, manipulating what they're saying, just simply avoiding having to even say anything. That's a big part. It's just, even just avoiding and having a conversation at all, shutting down your computer, or if you hear, you have a Black coworkers talking about discrimination, just kind of walking the other way and just not, dealing with it. So all this stuff is kind of, centering white feelings around this. And a lot of this comes with specific words that we use a lot, we see in media, instead of, talking about racist actions and policies and ideas and calling it racism. We use a lot of watered down words because that makes white people feel a little bit more comfortable about what's happening. We use words like racial divide, racial tension, racially charged. Like this situation in Ferguson is very racially charged. Just say it's a racist situation. You have, white police that or police in general that are oppressing Black communities. It's not racially charged. We sell this idea of racial divide, like there's like two sides to racism, and both sides are just, equally, harmed by racism. In reality, there's one side that's being harmed and there's one side that's benefiting. So it's not a divide, it's a hierarchy. So we really need to start calling these situations racism, white supremacy, whiteness, white culture, and not use watered down words. And this is a part of we've been talking a lot about this white supremacy culture that's just internalized into us, where white is right, white culture is more valued. We teach white history, which, as a standard curriculum, and everyone's other histories as electives. We teach white culture, and which oftentimes is made up culture, Confederate we have Confederate statues everywhere, and that's a made up, glorified history of whiteness, and we have way more of these Confederate statues than we do, other statues. So it's just, so we really we value this stuff, and we see the statues brought down. We focus on how does this make white people feel, when in reality, how does this make Black people feel, having to walk by a statue of a person who tried to who fought to keep them enslaved. So yeah, a lot of this is part of the white supremacy culture. It was about valuing white comfort and white safety above all else. And a lot of this is policed by what we call respectability politics, where we're going to talk more about this, but there's a lot of strategies on how we police this, like focus on the toning. You're too angry, you're not saying this right, you're not protesting right. There's always some idea that there's some way that if you just, Black people just did it, protested a certain way or spoke a certain way, everything would be fixed and we would all, understand each other, when in reality that is just not true. I mean, look at, Dr. King, we're always, a lot of people are like, why can't, people be more like him and protest peacefully? And look, he was killed. You can't, we got to stop saying, be more like Dr. King, because he was literally murdered for being like Dr. King. Or look at Colin Kaepernick. I mean, like, he literally, you cannot be a more peaceful protester by taking a knee. Like, he's literally just mean, and he lost his entire career for that. And look at the backlash or the whitelash that's happened because of literally someone just took a knee. So that, we use this as a way to kind of like just dismiss. You use respectability politics as a way to dismiss, any decentralizing or whiteness from a conversation. So we're going to talk about different forms of white centering, and probably the biggest one is just this form of this idea of white comfort. And we started out with Dr. Robin DiAngelo's white fragility. Talking about in the first class, and that's a really great way to kind of start understanding, white centering is white fragility, but also we need to understand that people have been working on, white centering and white decentering for decades. So this isn't a new concept, even though, Robin DiAngelo, coined the term white fragility. A lot of this, and like I said, it's a great, first step. It's a great way when you're new to this to kind of, be introduced to this. But after you read that book, also understand that's just kind of the first step of decentering. There's a lot more to learn. But white comfort is mainly just about valuing the way, making white people feel comfortable over the experiences of Black people dealing with racism. So, this can be in a lot of different forms, from just, avoiding conversations, dismissing, white explaining, gaslighting, spiritual bypassing. We'll talk a little bit more about. All we just need is more love. Let's not get, be so angry. We're so divided. All these different things that we're going to talk about in the respectability politics section. But a lot of it's just about, like ways to maintain white people feeling comfortable, so they don't have to have uncomfortable conversations, about like their complicity and complacency in systemic racism. That is a very uncomfortable conversation to have. There's just no way to really understand whiteness and white supremacy without being uncomfortable. There's just no way to that. So if your main point is to not be, uncomfortable, there's just no way you're ever going to get to a place to really understand what's going on. And another part is just like because white people, part of white supremacy culture is like everything belongs to us, and there's no words we can't use, there's no spaces we can't go to, there's no, actions we can't be a part of. So when we see specific actions to benefit, marginalized communities, we feel left out. And we instantly have to like have a reaction to that. Like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter never once said white lives didn't matter. What they were saying is in this country, there's systems that devalue Black lives, like policing, like criminal justice system, like, housing, so this is about, not, all lives can't matter until Black lives matter. But what a lot of white people instantly, there was an automatic internalized reaction to that, was like, well, what about white lives? What about all lives? So instantly we're feeling left out, and we had a reaction to that. Instead of listening to Black Lives Matter, we instantly go to this reaction of like, well, what about my life? And then a need for white people to be good. Like good white people, like the problem is these evil, nasty racists, and I'm not part of that. We see this a lot with the infamous line, not all white people, if someone's, talking about white supremacy, and then I'm not, white persons, well, not all white people. I'm not like that, that's just one, is derailing the conversation, again, making it, centering about white feelings. So let's have a conversation about, instead of talking about, how white people can get loans easier for homes. Instead, we're talking about, well, how does that make this white person feel, and we're trying to try to comfort that white person, like, oh yeah, I recognize it, not all white people, you're one of the good white people, but in reality, I mean, we're all part of the system. There's no escaping this. There's no neutrality. Like we are part of this system that benefits us, benefits white people, whether we like it or not. So please don't ever say not all white people. Let's try to fight that urge to be the good white person and get recognition for that being a good white person. Let's just understand the systems that we actually live in, that we're not at fault, for, but we are responsible for dismantling. And then another thing that I've been noticing a lot is just, well, a lot of white people have really uncomfortable, are really uncomfortable with just being labeled as white. I think that Lisa has a lot to do with, like, growing people up in this post-racial kind of, like, if you talk about race, that's a problem, or like, it's reverse racism. Don't label me as white. This idea that all white people are individuals, and all Black people are part of a stereotypical group that can be stereotyped. If there's a Black criminal, that just proves Black criminality, but if there's a white criminal, that's just an individual act. So a lot of people have this opposition to this idea of being, of just being all white, especially when when I hear the word whites, when someone's saying, well, whites do this or whites do that. A lot of white people have a hard time dealing with that, and I think we need to grow a little bit thicker skin, and stop pretending, if the worst thing that people can call white people is whites, that's still pretty easy compared to what the rest of the world is dealing with. So I really like this quote down here. People often say, stop being angry and educate us, not understanding that the anger is part of the education. To really, like I said, to really understand what's going on, you're going to have to be uncomfortable. There's no polite way to really let all, to understand how how white supremacy, works. So I read this other article or quote. It was like, there's no polite way to decolonize. There's no way to dismantle white supremacy without making white people uncomfortable. So it's not, and I agree. Like sometimes, like if you get some harsh feedback, maybe you didn't deserve that harsh feedback. Maybe it would have been better if they gave you nice feedback and helped you learn. Not to say, because I know, like, I don't want to downplay, it's tough getting harsh feedback, and especially when you're at front end. But at the same time, I mean, a lot of that, the anger comes from the fact that people are literally losing loved ones, and are living in poverty and dealing with all kinds of horrible situations because of the realities that we choose to ignore. So yes, sometimes we don't deserve, harsh, sometimes we deserve the feedback to be given a little bit nicer, but at the same time, we just need to grow thicker skins, because I mean, the reality is, we need to hear this regardless of how it's delivered to us. We need to stop paying attention on how it's delivered to us and start paying attention to what, the feedback is and what is causing this anger. So I really like this. Tim Wise, it's a really great anti-racist activist. I would recommend following, but he gave his quote: "What you are saying is my discomfort with you right now is worth more than the potential that your life could be snuffed in 10 minutes. Until that stops, nothing is going to change." And then white guilt is another one, which is, we got to be careful with this, because it's super easy to feel white guilt. I mean, I think I spent most of my 20s feeling, avoiding conversations about racism because I felt so much guilt about it. And for one, I mean, the problem is like, again, we don't, like I love this quote, like, dear white people, no one is asking you to apologize for your ancestors. We are asking you to dismantle the systems of oppression they built that you maintain and benefit from. We were born into these systems. We're not, they're not our fault. We don't need to feel shame about, this racial hierarchy that we were born into, but we do need to feel responsibility for dismantling this. So if you're feeling shame, oftentimes that can shut you down. That can help you avoid these conversations. Or help you avoid, not really recognizing what's happening, not having hard conversations, avoiding this stuff. Like I said, I spent a lot of my life avoiding conversations about racism because I knew it was bad. And I knew that, but I felt a lot of guilt about it. So one, not only does white guilt keep us from actually dismantling things, but also it centers the conversation around us, because when we feel guilty and we express, oh, I feel so awful about these what's happening, all of a sudden now the conversation's on you and your feelings, and people are going to try to help you feel better, especially people that love you and care for you are going to try to help you feel better. So again, we took the focus of this conversation from the effects of racism to you feeling guilty. So a lot of times it derails these conversations as well. I really like this quote by Audre Lorde. I cannot hide my anger to spare your guilt. Nor hurt feelings, nor answering anger. For to do so insults and trivializes all our efforts. Guilt is not a response to anger. It is a response to one's own action or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it is no longer guilt, but the beginning of knowledge. Yet all too often, guilt is just another name for impotence, for defensiveness, destructive of communication. It becomes a device to protect ignorance and continuation of things the way they are, the ultimate protection for changelessness. And then we have another form of white centering is white victimhood. So this is when somehow we reverse the roles. So instead of somehow, we're having a conversation about some racist action or policy that hurt, a Black person, and somehow we change it so that you, the white person, are now the victim in some way, shape, or form. So a lot of this is just like feeling attacked when someone tries to give you feedback. Regardless if it's like, however the tone is or whatever, it's just you're feeling attacked, and you're feeling like the real problem is this person's giving me feedback, or this person is being mean to me, and that voids the real reason why that person was trying to give you feedback in the first place, because there's being harm done by your actions or your support for racist policies. So a lot of times, we say things like, can't say anything anymore, can't say anything these days, trying to be the victim. And it's more about, it's not about the racism, that millions of people are facing. It's about that your Facebook, threads are full of, angry comments. And the big one that people use, and really think this is messed up, is when they start using their friendship. Like, I thought we were friends, I thought we understood that, I thought we had a friendship that where we can be open with each other. When in reality, what you're really saying is, I thought we had a friendship where you accepted whatever I said without giving me feedback and not without your opinion. So if we really had an open relationship, you would accept my feedback just as much as I would accept, I would, listen to what you had to say. Another one is falsely equating the anger of the person calling out to the hate the person is calling out. So we see this a lot, when people say the real problem is the people that bring up race all the time. They're just trying to divide us, political correctness out of control, all these things. Another way of being a white victimhood is feeling that you have to defend yourself as a good white person. We talked about this, someone says something about white supremacy, you follow up with not all white people. Or I have Black friends, or, I get a lot of people say, oh, I took the online racial bias, test, so I can't be racist, I've heard that line so many times. Or I voted for Obama, or if Obama could run for a third term, I would vote for him again, trying to distance yourself from the reality is that we're all part of the system. Another one is victim blaming, justifying, like, well, when someone's, tries to point out white privilege, you're like, well, do you know what I've gone through, and instantly, when in reality, like, yes, you've had a difficult, past, but that doesn't justify you continuing to do racist actions, because even though you had a difficult past, you didn't have to deal with systemic racism at every step on a daily occurrence. So. And then the last one is kind of like this myth of reverse racism, is like labeling any kind of policies for equality as white discrimination, like affirmative action is reverse racism. Stop making everything about race, so I'm going to read a couple of these quotes. I really want to read Ally Henny, really amazing person to follow. She says, I am sick and tired of everybody's offended and don't know how to act anymore culture. It is the peak of privilege. People from marginalized groups have spent their entire lives learning how to not run afoul of people in dominant groups, but you all can't handle the pressure of acting like decent human beings. Miss me with that. People are literally killed for not meeting dominant cultural standards, but you all are here falling to pieces because someone called you a bigot. Child bi. If you don't do bigoted stuff, nobody will call you a bigot. If you get called a bigot, it's probably because you're doing what? Being a bigot. That's really easy to fix. Meanwhile, people from marginalized groups just want to exist without wondering if they're going to catch some bigot on an off day and end up living their last day. But go ahead and get mad because you have to think before you speak and act. And she wrote a bunch of other great stuff that we're going to really talk about, cancel culture, and next week, and kind of dive into this white victimhood on a larger scale. I like this one a lot too. Accountability feels like an attack when you're not ready to acknowledge your toxic behavior. Or accountability is not shaming. If you feel shame, use it to examine why accountability makes you feel shame. I think that's really powerful. It's just be mindful of your reactions. If you're feeling a reaction, or if you're feeling like people are shaming you, if you feel like people are attacking you, well, instead of responding, maybe spend some time wondering why you feel that stuff when someone tries to give you feedback. All right. And then next one, this is kind of a form of white victimhood. We call white tears, but this is a very specific form of white victimhood. So I wanted to create this own slide to talk a little bit more about this. So Kimberly Crenshaw wrote, imagine first responders at the scene of an accident rushing to comfort the person whose car struck a pedestrian while the pedestrian lies bleeding on the street. So that's like kind of, generally the idea behind white tears is, say a white person, did something wrong, and then they immediately, turn on, like, it doesn't need tears, but oftentimes it has white tears, or it has, this feeling of basically creating this, yourself as a victim, and then people rush to see why you're crying and try to help comfort you, when in reality we completely forgotten the original situation, which was a racist action or towards a black person. So this is really important because this plays on. This is often done with white women, and I'm not saying that is to attack white women. We need to understand that this is how patriarchy and white supremacy have kind of mixed together in this society, and it's not women's fault, even though all of us need to take responsibility for dismantling this, including white women. But I'm not saying this to attack white women. I'm saying this is part of the patriarchal systems that have been set up in this country that we need to start dismantling. We're going to actually have a whole class on how patriarchy and white supremacy mixes, and we're going to read a lot. I'll talk a lot about like Dorothy Roberts and Angela Davis and different philosophies around that. But the idea behind white tears, it taps into this historical reference where we have, historically speaking, white women have lived under, patriarchy, a strong patriarchy in this country. We're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about the rise of capitalism, and capitalism didn't create patriarchy, but it definitely really added a lot of, it was a huge step for patriarchy, because in order to create this capitalistic society, we had to devalue, women's labor and work. We had to devalue reproductive labor. We had to put women in more of a subservient role where they had to be dependent on men and men's labor. That was part of capitalism emerging. So we had this new patriarchal system that came straight from Europe in the 1500s and the rise of capitalism, but was imported over to U.S. Where we basically took white women and we put them in this subservient role where they needed men to defend themselves, to provide for them and to defend them. And then at the same time, when slavery ended, how we continued to enslave, Black people. So we created this myth of Black criminality, that they're all dangerous and criminals and rapists, and we had to, enslave them continually through things like sharecropping, convict leasing, and especially things like violence. Like we had to control them through lynching and terrorism and policing and violence from the state. Mainly, a lot of times, and we invoked, this idea of protecting white women in order to justify the violence that we use to control Black people. And the reality it was just a bunch of white rich men who wanted to continue to get rich by enslaving, because they had created this plantation, the whole economy of the South was based on plantation model, a capitalist plantation model that basically exploited labor and exploited land to make a small group of people super wealthy. And that, we still have that, system today. We have never got rid of that system, but in order to continue that system, they had to use violence against Black people to continue to keep them as exploited labor, and they used the patriarchy role of white women, in these subservient roles, and they need to be protected to kind of enforce that. Again, this isn't, like white women are one of the main victims of all of this, but at the same time, we've created this culture that is often used by white people, particularly white women, to invoke a racial hierarchy through violence. A perfect example, that a couple years ago, this Oakland woman, she saw a Black, family that were barbecuing in this park, and there was literally a grill. It's like everyone, like there was, everyone else, it is the park that you barbecue, it's totally fine, but she had a problem with his family and called the police on him. And you could see, she was, very serious face, knew what she was doing, calling the cops on this, Black family. But when the cops arrived, instantly, it came to tears, because she was invoking this idea, and she was playing off of this, idea that's been internalized with us, and that, here's a, subservient white, woman that needs to be comforted, and at the same time that takes away what's really happening and the racism that's really happening, and kind of centers her feelings. But I need to put a caveat too, because I have a lot of friends also that when they're in stressful situations, they do cry. And it's more of a physiological reaction. So it's important for us not to jump on all white people crying, and kind of understand that. But just because a white person's crying based on a stressful situation, or anyone crying based on such stressful situation, is not necessarily because it's like this white tears. It's what they do afterwards. Does someone cry, but then still stay in this conversation and still work it out, still try to figure things out with you? That's fine. But if they're using white tears to kind of manipulate the conversation, that's when it becomes this idea of white tears, white victimhood. So I feel like I need to put this caveat, because I do have a lot of friends that when they're called out or in stressful situations, they do have tears, but at the same time, they're not using that to manipulate. They're still working through these conversations, and that's what really matters. So I'm going to read this last quote. Picture it: a white woman feels challenged or uncomfortable about something a Black person said or did. Instead of using her words, she cries. Instantly, no matter what the initial catalyst of the situation is, she ends up being appeased, pacified, and pampered. Lord knows we've all seen virtual white women's tears shut down conversations, even if she was the instigator of the conflict. The other person ends up being scolded or fired or arrested or killed. White women's tears are especially potent because they are attached to the symbol of femininity. Sorry. All right, so now we're going to play a video. this conversation involving Julie Black. She's a singer and an activist in Canada, but she's on some panel where they're talking about different books that children can read to kind of work on decolonizing Canada, which is Canada is dealing with a lot of colonial structures, a lot of anti-Indigenous structures, particularly there. They have a lot of anti-Indigenous racism in Canada that they're working on. So I'm going to play this really quickly.
It's important for us to really look at what book is going to have Canada open their eyes to what is happening on today. And yes, we celebrate and we heal and we kumbaya and we light.
But you remember what's happening with ourselves. I mean, this is we got to change the world, but people are really, there are a lot of like screwed up people in the world.
There's a lot of colonial
privilege. There's a lot of people that really
this room excluded, of course.
And
this studio excluded.
Yeah,
there's a lot of people that have to work on themselves. I mean, when we
there's a lot of people who sit in their cottages in their homes and don't have an experience like others and think that it's, well, you know, let me swipe my Visa card and make a donation, but I don't live this experience. What are we doing to change the current circumstances? We just had a Pope say he's not saying I'm sorry to Indigenous Canadians when he said that in 2015. It is happening right now.
I'm not saying
it's got to change. Yes, we forgive. I believe in Jesus.
But why are you attacking me, Julie? Why are you attacking me? No, I totally get what you're saying, and I have.
Hold on, we're live right now. Why are you attacking me?
I'm not attacking you.
The truth hurts. I didn't say anything to attack you, Jeannie Becker. I said nothing about Jeannie Becker.
No, I'm just saying
Did I say anything about Jeannie Becker?
I just feel that you're speaking to me like I don't believe that. I totally get what you're saying.
Let me tell you what you just said. I feel like. So whatever you're feeling, take it to the altar, because I'm not the one that's responsible for your feelings.
That's such a powerful way. I think that just perfectly, summarizes, when, Black people or when Black Indigenous people of color are trying to, talk about racism with white people. And even though they're not saying, like, you do this, they're talking about white supremacy and whiteness and what, all these things, white people instantly get defensive and instantly feel like you're attacking me personally. And I just think, like, that conversation just like perfectly just summarized that. If only there was a Julie Black that could, jump into all of our conversations with that great one last line. But I also wanted to point, when she was talking about the Pope, this is really important to understand because we talked about this before, where a lot of anti-Indigenous racism comes, it's really started from the Catholic Church in the 1400s that really passed a bunch of doctrines that not only pushed this idea that, non-Christian Indigenous people were savages and uncivilized, but also, gave legal permission, gave, moral permission for European colonial governments to basically kill, and dominate and genocide, ethnic cleansing of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous countries. So, having the Pope apologize for that is important, because in there it's a form of decolonization because they're actually part of colonialism is erasing the history of Indigenous culture, Indigenous life. So by having the Pope, actually apologize and recognize that would be a huge form of decolonization because it's actually acknowledging the actual history, which is something that we don't do. Cool. And so the last part about white censoring is just white silence. So it's just like how easy it is for white people, just to, myself included, when I'm overwhelmed or just not feeling it, or I just, I mean, literally most of the time I could just turn off my computer and then I'm done. I'm out of racism. I don't have to see it. I mean, I do see it throughout the world as I'm going to work and all those things, but then it's just, it's also very easy for me, if I hear about racial discrimination at work, it's very easy for me to just kind of sit in my cubicle and focus on something else. If I hear, a family member give a racist joke, it's very easy to me for just to laugh it off and change the subject. So this white silence equals violence. It's not just enough. And, I like this quote. At some point, you have to realize your silence is injustice. Silence for injustice is support for injustice. And that's not to say at the same time, it's important for us to have self-care. It's important for us to take care of ourselves so we actually stay in this battle for a long time. rather than, going full force for 2 weeks and then burn yourself out and being done for the whole year. You want to take care of yourself so you can actually, be a good advocate. But if I could just say one thing, I see this a lot on Facebook. A lot of white people are just like, oh man, this is just too much for me. Everything's so negative. I'm going to take a break. Give me a call. I'm going to be off Facebook. If you need to get a hold of me, give me a call. And it's just, it annoys me in two different ways. One is, it's just like the social media world. Like, why do you need to tell me that you're taking a break? Just take a break, but that's like the whole, self-centeredness of social media is like telling us what, if they're in a good mood or if you had a good breakfast or things, well, whatever. I mean, but then the second part is like, imagine being, a Black person who's dealing with racism on a daily, basis, who can't ever escape it, and then reading, your white friend's quote about how they're too stressed out because their Twitter feed or Facebook feed is full of, negativity, and there's a lot of angry comments, and they just can't take it anymore. So just imagine what that would look like and how that would feel. So let's just not do it. I mean, if you got to take breaks, great. Just don't announce it, and do what you need to do. Get yourself back into the fight, and to get back into advocating. But the big thing is also just understanding that there is no neutrality in whiteness, because whiteness was created, and whiteness can only be defined as a part of a racial hierarchy. So just by just staying silent and not advocating, even if you're not participating, if you don't, you're not using the N-word, you're not, whatever, you're not joining the KKK or whatever, you're not, non-racist, that's not enough. I mean, that just by, being silent, you're maintaining the status quo, and that status quo is white supremacy. So I'm gonna read this really great Layla Assad. She wrote this really great book, Me and White Supremacy book. Definitely check it out. Her original one was like a workbook, and had a lot of great assignments. I think that her book is probably very similar, but it's worth, definitely check it out. A lot of times, nice, well-meaning white women can contribute in a big way to the racist problems we see because they don't speak up, or they want to keep things polite, or they think that the best thing they can do is just focus on being a loving person rather than getting involved in politics. White silence, white privilege, and white shame leads to a lot of white complicity to white supremacy. All right, so just some tips on kind of like decentering whiteness. And some of these are really easy. Some of these are just believe Black, Indigenous, people of color's experiences. Don't argue with them. Don't try to white explain them. Don't tell them how they got it wrong, or, I'm sure police had something else, there was something else to that story. Just believe people. That is such a huge, huge part. Believe people, laying down your privilege is listening to oppressed people without arguing, interrogating, minimizing, or gaslighting them. So that's just a huge, it's really simple too. Like, it really doesn't revolve. I mean, you don't even have to like write, a big thing. You just kind of believe people. Just nod your head, say, yes, I believe you. Like that's a powerful, because like 90% of white people aren't doing that. Also amplify, Black, Indigenous people's own voices, instead of co-opting or instead of blocking them. When they say something great, promote them, share things, but also give them credit. Don't steal their voice, for your own ego or for your own projects. Explore ways, don't avoid, when you're feeling, uncomfortable, when feeling white discomfort, don't avoid that, spend some time with that. Try to like really find out the roots, find out what are the subjects that cause you to feel that. Is it when people call out all white people, do you feel uncomfortable? When people, call out police, do you feel uncomfortable? Find those subjects and kind of, work on, on what are the roots behind that? What is your beliefs there? Pause on that uncomfortability. Pause before responding, reacting. This is a big one, like I write out so many angry responses, but it's amazing if you just sit with it for 24 hours. We feel this urgency to have this like in the moment conversation on social media is just crazy. So sit with things, spend some time being like, am I acting this way because, am I centering this issue around my experience and my comfort, or am I actually listening what someone else is experiencing? And so a lot of times we need to process these things when we start diving deeper into our uncomfortability, white comfort. A lot of it is because of these beliefs we've internalized, so it's important to find white only anti-racism spaces. This is what when we have Surge, Surge. I always forget what the acronym stands for. Supporting. It's like racial justice is the last part. But Surge is an amazing organization. It's a white anti-racism organization. They're not mainly white because they're trying to segregate things, or because they understand there's a lot of work white people need to do, and when they're processing these things, a lot of having Black people in the same room and having to listen to this stuff can be traumatizing, because if you're a Black person who's literally lost loved ones, and then you gotta listen to a white person kind of process how hard it is for them to bring humanity to that situation or something like that. It's just traumatizing. So it's important to have these white only spaces that don't actually continue to perpetuate trauma. And you could you could be honest, and we need to be honest. Again, it's not about shaming and feeling bad because we feel we have these beliefs. It's just about understanding this is this is the society I was born into. This is what I've absorbed from the society I was born into, and just kind of being honest with it. So it helps to have these white only spaces like Surge to really process this stuff, and because it can be an ugly process sometimes, processing these things. And then educating other people on white censoring. Don't just work on yourself, also work on educate your friends and families and people in your community. Oftentimes white people will listen better to other white people, and that sucks. That's a stupid reality, but that is a reality of our white supremacy system, is we are geared to listen and acknowledge other white people more. So using our privilege to make it, when people say use your privilege to make a difference, that's using knowing that reality sucks. I wish that wasn't the reality, but that is the reality. So just using our privilege to be in that voice to educate other people about white censoring. Spend time understanding decolonizing your history, desegregating your realities. Just working on just growing and learning more about experiences of Black, Indigenous people of color and the histories of this country, the real histories, not what we teach in high school. And then just becoming a better ally. There's some really great videos about being an ally. We're going to show that later. But there is a really great point. Always center the impacted. Listen and learn from those who live in oppression. Leverage your privilege. Yield the forward. So there's a lot of great. Actually, I'm going to play a video about being an ally on the next slide. Actually. And then I want to read this last part. Reminder to white people: you will continue to mess up with racism. So continue to be teachable, open to correction from people of color, and vigilantly monitor yourself for defensiveness and white fragility. You never arrive as an ally. You must continue to practice this allyship. All right. So now I'm going to play a video. This is from Enchante, the artist. It's how to be a good ally, identity, privilege, and resistance. It's a quick video. It's like a couple minute video, but it's it's being a good ally. It's not overly complicated. It just kind of has a couple principles that she does a really good job, describing.
Lean on me when you're not strong. Hey, it's Asante, and today we're talking about allyship. A big thing to remember is that allyship isn't passive. If there's a war, your allies don't just sit there like, oh my gosh, genocide? Oh, that sucks, man. Oh, I can't. It's so hard. I don't get it. People can be so awful. I'm totally on your side. The times we live in, it's just so hard. No, they lend their troops, they lend their ships, they send supplies, they send medics, they will go in and fight for you. Allyship is not neutrality. Allyship is not, I believe in you. Good luck! Allyship is an active process that you're always working on. So here are a few steps you can take to be a better ally. First, listen and educate yourself. When people in marginalized groups tell you about harassment or hardships that they're facing because of that marginalization, believe them wholeheartedly.
deeply. If you feel ignorant in some areas, feel free to ask questions, but maybe ask them to Google first. Trust me, I've asked Google some pretty weird things. It's never offended, and it always has some sort of answer. It's not anyone's responsibility to be your personal tutor on social issues, especially if you're not paying them personal tutor money. There are plenty of resources that are already out there, people who have shared their perspectives in books, articles, YouTube videos. Find the resources that have already been laid out for you. Find the people who are already talking about this stuff online. And as an ally, you should be constantly learning. There's not the Black experience or the queer experience or the experience of being a disabled person. There are so many different ways of walking through the world, being perceived by others, and living at the intersection of various identities and abilities. So even if you think you've heard everything, listen. The second thing that you can do to be a good ally is to uplift marginalized voices. Retweet them, mention them to your friends, highlight them, spotlight them, feature them, hire them, and hire them into positions of authority where they feel empowered to voice their concerns and act on them. Consult with people of color and trans people and neurodiverse people, and then pay them for their time because consulting is a job. Wherever you can, bring diverse people into the conversation. A third thing you can do as an ally is speak up. When you see injustice, when you hear someone being bigoted, call them on their BS. Yeah, it may make you uncomfortable having to point out that someone's being racist, but imagine how uncomfortable Black and brown people feel having to live with that crap every day. It can even be easier to call something out if it's not being directed at you and challenging your very existence. As an ally, you can take that burden off of someone who is already hurting. And if you remain neutral in that sort of situation, you're not an ally. You're not helping. Some people also worry about it being not their place to, for example, speak of issues of race if they're white. But speaking up about injustice isn't the same as speaking for a marginalized group. It is everyone's place to call out problematic behavior, especially since as an ally, you're in a position of privilege and have less fear of retaliation. White people who are slightly racist are more likely to listen to other white people. So as a white ally, it's on you to get your people. Go get your mans. Whose mans is this? Your relatives are likely to listen to you because they usually care about you at least a little bit, and you kind of can't avoid them. So when you're sitting around the table and your auntie acts like people can't be bisexual, call her on it. That is your role as an ally. Bring a supportive voice to the table at tables where I'm never invited to sit. Reach your communities that I don't have access to. Use your privilege to speak where other people would be silenced. Another thing you can do as an ally is to respect safe spaces. Everyone wants to come home at the end of the day. Sure, I may be up for academic debate of politics and social issues, but there are some times when I don't want to be challenged. I don't want to always have to be playing defense. Sometimes I just want to be around other like-minded people with similar experiences who get it. It's empowering, it's strengthening, it's emotionally enriching to be able to fellowship with people without judgments or pretenses or awkward questions just from being who you are. Don't take issue with people coming together around their identity, especially since if you're in the dominant culture, you probably get to do it all the time without even trying. Respect that there's Pride Month, respect that there's Black History Month, and realize that as an ally, the world is already suited to you in that respect. If you're straight and cis, you've probably never feared being threatened for expressing your gender or felt like you needed to hide your sexuality. If you're white living in a dominantly white country, you've probably always seen people who share your heritage in the history books. If you're able-bodied and neurotypical, you probably have never been stopped from entering a common space because it's inaccessible, or had to retreat from a common space because it's overwhelming. Respect the spaces and times of the year where people who are usually sidelined get to take center stage. If you're an ally, you'll be fine with the fact that this is not about you, and sometimes that means politely excusing yourself from spaces meant specifically for marginalized groups. The fifth thing that you can do as an ally is to get to work. Yeah, you gotta do the work. Use your strengths, your access, your resources to help the cause. Protests can be great, but we're not all meant for marching in the streets. You can call people in the government. You can financially support community programs. You can volunteer for supportive organizations. If you're a lawyer, you can give pro bono counsel. If you're a doctor, you can get involved in a clinic. Whatever you do can probably be used to do good for marginalized communities. And if you want more ideas on quick action steps you can take, check out the video I did on the Resist Challenge a while back. Being an ally is an active process, and it's not something that you bestow upon yourself. You don't just get to say, I'm not transphobic or homophobic or racist, therefore I'm an ally. Check. We are always unlearning the prejudices we've been socialized in, and we're all problematic in our different ways. True allyship involves valuing people with experiences different from ours, learning about our privileges and natural prejudices, and working to make the world more equitable in spite of them. In the comments, let me know how allyship has played out in your experience, or how you think folks could be better allies. You can like this video if you liked it, subscribe to see more, and if you want to help me make more and do more with this channel, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Totally up to you, but I would greatly appreciate it. As always, remember to live spiritedly and think creatively. What's been making me happy this week is
Sorry. Asante, the artist, is really great channel. I definitely recommend following and supporting if you can. I think the biggest thing about that is just like that being an ally is just this ongoing thing that you're going to slip up, you're going to mess up, and that's fine as long as you own it and have humility and you learn from it. And it's just this ongoing process of just like educating yourself and learning how to like promote what Black Indigenous people are doing and initiatives to support their rights. And I really like this one part when she's talking about like sometimes white people feel like it's not their place to speak up. Because we heard that in the New York Times video that we played about with all the white people talking about that. And there was this one guy that said, I just feel like I'm not an expert in race, so I shouldn't, talk about racism. And that's true in some areas. Like, you don't need to be going to a Black Lives Matter, meeting and start, educating people about your thoughts about race. Definitely. But at the same time, it's all of our responsibilities to not only learn and educate ourselves about race, but also call out racism in our white communities. We can't just rely on the people who are living racism to be the one to always call it out. We need to step up, and it's ugly and it's sometimes tough, but it gets better the more that we do it and the more we learn from it. All right, so on the other end of white censoring, we're going to talk about our last section of this class today. The last part is respectability politics. So this is kind of, it's kind of like the defense of white censoring is kind of how we avoid, how we manipulate conversations around our white feelings and how we avoid actually acknowledging and validating what's happening to people outside of our white segregated world. So I'm going to read this, just this last quote. Jesse Williams, he gave us a really great speech when he won this, the BET Humanitarian Award 2016. He said, if you have a critique for the resistance, for our resistance, then you better have an established record of critique for our oppression. And that just, like, that sat with me really well. I just instantly thought about all my white friends that are just constantly criticizing, Black resistant movements. Oh, you shouldn't, shut down highways or streets. You shouldn't be, creating, actions that may be violent or could, allow violence to happen. You shouldn't be doing all this and that. And these same people have zero, critique, for the actual systemic racism that Black resistance is fighting for. It's like being critical of Nat Turner, being a violent slave revolt without ever mentioning or being critical of slavery. So it's important for us to understand, you don't get to critique these things if you're not actually, critiquing the oppression that these things are fighting for. And even then, it's important for us to support, these movements, not to tear them down. And we hear a lot of this, a lot of white people are like, whoa, we should, Black Lives Matter was just a terrible name. It should have been a better name, and it wouldn't be so confusing. And we hear the same thing with defund the police. I'm hearing a lot of that. And that's not really, our part as an ally is not to critique these things, it's to promote and support these things. Because let's be honest, people understand what defunding police, initiatives are. This is right-wing media that's trying to, manipulate this by adding other definitions. But anyway, okay, so let's jump into respectability politics. I'm going to start with there's a really great article by Damon Young from from The Root. So he wrote this. I'm going to read just highlight it, but I definitely recommend reading the whole article. He wrote this about respectability politics. When minority or marginalized groups are told or teach to themselves that in order to receive better treatment from a group in power, they must behave better. It's a concept that has existed within Black America since Black people have been in America. The idea that if we walk a little straighter or write a little neater and speak a little clearer, then white people will treat us better. But it's a fallacy, logically, emotionally, and spiritually. for 4 reasons. And the 4 reasons he's talking about is, one, it shifts the responsibility of the systemic racism and all the problems Black people are feeling from these actual systems to the Black people. So it's a victim blaming thing. It's like if you just, like puts the responsibility of all these systems that have kept Black people in poverty, in concentrated poverty, and all the things that remove them economic opportunities, and then just saying, well, you just need to take more responsibility. You just need to try harder. So it's a victim blaming rule. Another one is it provides he talks about it provides a false sense of security for those who believe in it, and that's the idea, because we hear because it's not just white people are saying respectability politics. A lot of well-off Black people also say it as well, with this idea that if you get to a certain point, you're kind of above this, above this racism, when in reality, it doesn't matter how much wealth you have, you're still going to be affected by racism. There's a lot of rich Black people that get pulled over by police. There was Henry Gates Jr., the guy did the show about he's a professor, but he's also he's done a lot of great stuff, but he's also did that show about tracking celebrities' heritages and stuff and ancestors, but I can't remember the name. But he was stopped. He was trying to get in his home. He had locked himself out and was trying to, I think, get into the house, and police came and kind of roughed him up. So it doesn't matter if you're a professor, if you have a PhD, or if you have a lot of money, you're still going to experience this stuff. So it creates this false sense that like I could just achieve and get to a certain point, white people will treat me better. And that may happen in some cases, but there's still going to be other cases where it's not true. And the third part he talks about is it doesn't work. Look at Dr. King. He was literally killed for preaching, peace, to be peaceful. Look at Colin Kaepernick. You can't be more peaceful than just taking a knee, and he lost his entire career because of that. And then the last thing he talks about is, even if it did work, I love being Black too much to be less than me to gain some safety. And that comes with the idea that, part of what makes white people feel safe is white culture, having whiteness being the norm. So like when we talk about what does it mean to look professional? It's based on white standards, so Black people who, may have different standards, different hair and different, appearances, those are instantly, deemed unprofessional, so you have to kind of look like white people. So a lot of this is like, you have to act like white people, you have to adopt white people, you have to look like them in order to actually get respect, and so that in itself is kind of destroying Black culture. So the general idea of all this is like this, that we use this as this myth. Respectability politics is a myth that if Black people just acted a certain way or did something, a little bit better, or just protested in a certain way, everything would be better. White people would hear what they're saying, we would get together and we would fix everything. And that's a myth. That's never actually happened, ever. So we need to, all the rights that we've gained in the history of this country has been for, out of fighting for it. It's not been, we'll do this in a peace, we'll meet them at their terms and then they'll just give us our rights. So it's really important to understand respectability politics. And so there's a lot of different forms of respectability politics that we're going to explore. A big one is tone policing. So I'm reading this by the blog Anger is Justified. Tone policing, simply put, is a dismissal of a person's argument, generally a less privileged person in social justice discourse, because of their tone, which may be perceived by the bigoted, more privileged person as too personal, too emotional, or too angry. Meanwhile, the oversensitivity argument basically amounts to the bigoted, more privileged person telling the less privileged person to suck it up and deal with the abuse the hierarchy deals out. Put together, these things add to a massive display of double standards. I shouldn't have to deal with your justified anger or pain, but you should just sit back and take my unjustified bigotry. So this is when the idea is that, because a lot of times, like if you're, experiencing racism every day, if you've lost loved ones, from police brutality, and one of your white friends posts Blue Lives Matter, I mean, it's going to be really hard to just, kindly say, by the way, can I just, have a little feedback for your comment? No, it's a natural reaction to be angry and to let, but that anger is natural. It's not, it's not wrong, and it doesn't invalidate what that person's trying to say. But what white people do is they use that anger to be like, look, that person's angry. I'm just going to focus on the anger and completely ignore the why that person's angry. Make it about my terms, make my emotions the center of this conversation. So it's about, reasons why people tone police is about being emotional does not make one's point any less valid. Anger is valid, anger is important, anger brings social change, anger is not counterproductive, anger is not hate. There's a lot of people that try to associate anger with hate. And I saw this a lot, in 2016, the night of the Trump won, a lot of my conservative friends just went around, everyone was complaining about how, scared they were that white supremacists just became the most powerful person in our country. And I saw all these conservatives write in, there's just so much hate now, kind of say our concern was hate for them, trying to, again, center this horrific situation that's about to happen, or did happen, and it's about to continue to happen for 4 years, they took it, conservatives took it as that we were being hateful towards them. And so that's, that's the power of tone policing. It's just really, again, take this situation and make it about your emotions and what you're feeling. And it's important to understand politeness. The ultimate goal of tone policing is we need to be more polite, more kind, but politeness is often behavior expectations enforced upon marginalized people. What it really communicates is, I don't care about your experience or oppression or how it makes you feel. I only care about how it's discomforting for me to hear about it. And this is, especially done towards Black women. We're going to talk a lot about this next class. There's a lot of stereotypes. Probably the most stereotyped people in this country are Black women, I would argue. And we're going to, dive into that next week. But I love this quote. It says, "Black women will always be too loud for a world that never intended on listening to them." And that's one of the reasons why that's one of the stereotypes is Black women are loud and bossy and dominant. When we label them that anytime they're just trying to speak up for themselves. And that's really important to understand. I'm going to read just this first line. "Marginalized people often do not have the luxury of emotionally distancing themselves from discussion on their rights and experience. Tone policing is the ultimate derailing tactic. When you tone police, you automatically shift the focus of the conversation away from what you or someone else did that was wrong and onto the other person and their reaction." So yeah, don't tone police. Please don't. We, as white people, we need to grow tougher skins. And even if, like I said, even if that you didn't deserve that tone, if the worst thing that's happened to you is someone sends you a harshly toned message, that's still not that bad compared to what people are living with and dying with right now with racism. And then this idea of civility, we always push this stuff. We just need more civil, with our conversations, with, be more civil with our dialects. And I really like this quote: "For the oppressor, peace isn't the absence of violence. For the oppressor, peace is the absence of response to their violence." So what we consider to be peace, it is more of just our society accepting the actions of the state, the violent actions of the state. It's not actually dismantling the violence that the state is doing. Rachel Cargill, always talks about, she does a great job mentioning, elaborating on this, how nice does not equal not racist. A lot of white people think that in order to be, nice people can't be racist. If you're a nice white person with good intentions, you just can't be racist. And that's not true. What you're racist based on the outcomes of your actions. So I'm going to read this last quote on the bottom. "Proud racism advocates for walls to keep brown people out of America. Polite racism builds different sorts of walls. It leveraged concepts like civility and unity to make sure certain voices are kept out of power or are dismissed as troublemaking and divisive when they try and critique power. What civility really means in all of these discussions, of course, is servility. What unity really means is uniform acceptance of the status quo." So I'm gonna play this clip. This is from Angela Davis. So she was in prison for a bit. I should have brushed up on this history. I believe it was like she had loaned a gun, to somebody who used it in a shootout with some police. But this was on top of what COINTELPRO, and this was like the FBI was trying to bring, they were trying to put her away for murder, for loaning this handgun, and this was on top of a whole lot of like FBI, during the 60s, cracking down and trying to murder civil rights activists through the COINTEL program. So there was a lot more than just this. But so she was in prison. She ultimately defended herself and got off. Did a great job and got everything, the charges dismissed. But during prison, she gave a bunch of interviews. And there's this one interview where the reporter was asking her, does she believe in violence? Mainly because we really paint this picture of Black Panthers, particularly the Black Panthers, but Black nationalism, about this, they're always violent organization, I remember realizing, one of my favorite movies growing up was Forrest Gump. And if you remember, Forrest Gump, like that clip with the Black Panther, and he was just yelling and violent, like that's some racism that movie perpetuated, because that's very intentional. When in reality, the Black Panthers were a lot of what they did was just establishing social networks, and they started their breakfast programs, which inspired our nationwide breakfast programs, and did all these social services, but they used guns to protect themselves. They didn't use guns to be violent towards others. They used them to protect themselves against a violent police force. So this anyway, but this is the time we instantly started, our media were perpetuating our this fear of Black Panthers, and then that there are these violent extremists and terrorists, so the reporter asked Angela Davis, well, do you support all this violent, Black resistance? And this is her response.
And then you ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through, what Black people have experienced in this country since the time the first Black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
All right. I think that last line, I mean, you could just say that, like, going from every critique about the resistance of Black people from white people, you can mention that last line, like you actually were critiquing how Black Lives Matter. Like it's hard for me to imagine you have any idea what Black people have gone through in order for you to actually contrive this movement. And I think that it just perfectly summarizes a lot of white reactions on white explaining and white critiques of Black people resistance. So there's this idea that a lot of white people push about this divided myth, that we're more divided now than ever. We're such a divided society, and that is just again, you're going back to what Angela Davis said. Like, in order to push that myth, you just have to have like such a misunderstanding of the history of this country. Because this country was literally founded as a slaveocracy. It was founded on white supremacy. It was founded on patriarchy. We have been divided, among race and gender and class and religion since the birth of this country. We literally had laws that segregated and divided us, explicitly, like Jim Crow. We had slavery, racial-based slavery systems. And for someone to just be like, we're more divided now than ever, it's just like, it's insane. And what reality is, in my opinion, what really is happening is the white people are more divided. There's never been, this country has always been divided on everything else, but white people generally stuck together in this segregated bubble where they completely aren't aware of the negative realities. And I think a lot of white people are becoming aware these days, are becoming aware of what's happening outside of their segregated world and the negative realities of white supremacy. And at the same time, I think a lot of white people are also double downing on this myth that this belief that how we experience the world is how everyone else experiences the world. And so I think the divide, what's happening is that divide is happening in the white world, from people waking up to white supremacy and people still, defending that white supremacy doesn't exist. And so there's a couple quotes I talk about. So Bree Newsome Bass, if you haven't follow her. She, especially on Twitter, some of the most amazing quotes. She became kind of famous. She's been working on an anti-racist activist and writer and all different kinds of things. But it was like maybe I don't know exactly when, a couple of years ago she climbed I think it was the South Carolina government building, or one of those states that still had the Confederate flag, still flown the Confederate flag in front of their state building. She climbed it and brought it down. And but anyway, she's amazing. I definitely follow her, support her. But she writes, just so we're clear, conservatives argue that America was more united when we were literally segregated, and that things are more divisive whenever Black people assert our citizenship or humanity. Just so we're clear, that's white supremacy. And I like this quote down here. What bothers me about the term racial divide is that it acts as if racism is somehow two-directional mutual misunderstanding. I'm going to read this last quote. This is from a really great article on The Guardian, kind of countering this idea about tribalism. In the Trump era, America finds itself with two political parties, one that's growing more reliant on the nation's diversity, and one that sees its path to power in stoking fear and rage towards those who are different. America doesn't have a tribalism problem. It has a racism problem, and the parties are not equally responsible. We got to get away from it. Again, I said a lot about this. We got to get away from this idea that, summarizing, what's happening in this world and people's resistance as tribal. Anyone that says that just completely misunderstands what's going on and misunderstands. And you can only do that from a high place of racial privilege, looking down at Black group and just, at a superficial level saying, oh, they're united around this identity. They must be tribal, when in fact they're fighting for survival. And to call, their fight for survival tribalism, it's just really messed up. Anyway. So we probably all are familiar with Martin Luther King Jr.'s white moderate speech. I am going to read it just one more time, and just in case anyone isn't. But he writes, he wrote this during the, I believe it was in I know it's from the book Letters from Birmingham or something. I read it a long time ago, but he wrote this in jail, I believe during the 50s, the Montgomery boycott, but I may be wrong. But he wrote this about, because he kept on receiving all these letters from all these like white, leaders who were, for civil rights, but just thought he was moving too quickly or were critiquing his strategies. So he wrote, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods or direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient system. There's another great quote. He says, if peace means a willingness to be exploited, economically, dominated, politically, humiliated, and segregated, I don't want peace. If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. Peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the absence of the existence of justice for all people. Which is, you read that and then you hear people say, oh, you should be more like Martin Luther King and be quiet with your protests. It really comes out a lot. But I think this is important because there are, a lot of white moderates, people proud, I think a lot of, I see a lot of people that are like proud to be a white moderate who think that the moderation, is what's going to bring this country together. And, if we just, they spouse a lot of respectability politics. We just, they think that the problem is that we're too divided and we're not listening to each other. If we could just get together and listen to each other, everything would be fixed. And that sounds nice. I mean, we should all listen to each other more, but that doesn't actually dismantle oppressive systems. And that, and that's usually these listening sessions never get beyond just listening to. And oftentimes, a lot of these listening sessions they normalize a lot of these misconceptions around systemic oppression and systemic racism. But I find interesting is a lot of these white moderates don't associate themselves with the same white moderate that Martin Luther King is talking about. Like when they read this quote, they think it's some other white moderate that was like, existed in the 60s, but not themselves. Not the, and I think it's important to really, help people understand that, there's no difference between the white moderates in the 60s and the white moderates today. They're the same people. Martin Luther King are talking about the same people. So I think it's important to understand, let people know, that this is, what you're doing is what Dr. King warned us against. And another thing about respectability politics is we see a lot of is spiritual bypassing. So spiritual bypassing is basically, instead of doing the work of dismantling racism or working on yourself, doing the hard work, it's instead just kind of bypassing all that and just get into like an easy thing. Let's just all be kind to each other. We all need, if we could just treat everyone like human beings, if we could just love more and not be so hateful, not be so angry, not be so divisive. And you see this a lot. But I mean, the reality is none, these are just ways to kind of avoid the real issue that's happening. So to use spirituality to reject, avoid, stifle, or redirect blame for issues that cause personal discomfort. So Rachel Cargill writes, the easiest way for white women to skirt around the realities of racism is to just love and light it away. When confronted with ways they have offended or marginalized groups, they have offended a marginalized group with their words or actions. They immediately start to demand unity and peace, painting those they harmed as aggressive, mean, and divisive. And some of these quotes I think do a really great job summarizing. Imagine if white people weren't committed to the idea of niceness and instead committed to justice and eventually actually dismantling whiteness itself. Because I would say the majority of the white people I know think the solution is just being more nice and more kind to each other. And I'm not saying that those are bad things, yes, we all should be, more nice and more kind, but we should also be dismantling things, oppressive systems, because you can't be nice to people that you're also oppressing, that's the contradiction. So I really like this last quote. People often weaponize positivity to stifle legitimate critique and debate. I think that hits it on the nail. I mean, they're literally weaponizing, positivity as a way to avoid legitimate critique and legitimate debate. We've talked about the Ellen DeGeneres, how she was like defending Bush as her friend because she thinks we should all be kind to each other, including people that we disagree with. But what about being kind to the hundreds of thousands of people that he killed when he created a war based on lies? And we know, again, like that's not like opinion. Like we know that he lied about the weapons. I mean, there was like a lot of people in his administration came out and said, yes, he knew what he was doing. He knew there was no weapons, but he wanted to wage a war. Or the neo-colonial government, his administration wanted to wage war. So we were like, yeah. So who deserves to be nice? Does Bush, deserve, niceness? But what about all the survivors of the people of the people who lost, families and all the, all the survivors of the victims of our Iraqi war? Do they deserve niceness? How does that look? And so I think it's important to understand, niceness does not equal not racist. Niceness does not dismantle systemic racism. Like we need to actually do the work. And the last part we're going to talk about is just when we talk about violence, a lot of times we really just say violence for some physical thing. We don't understand that there's a lot of different forms of violence. So like violence is far more than physical or even verbal. It's a deep-seated societal belief that ignores, invalidates, and denies the basic human rights of anyone or group of people. Rachel Carver writes, white violence doesn't have to be lynching on a tree or a direct racist comment. It could be the dismissal of black pain in order to maintain white comfort by white women who just want to love. The World Health Organization actually defines violence. Defining outcomes solely in terms of injury or death thus limits the understanding of the full impact of violence. There's a lot, I realize this Reverend Dr. William Barber, he's been doing the Poor People's Campaign, and he's been doing all this great work in North Carolina. But he writes, America has to be careful of who she calls violent. When you deny health care, that's violent. When you deny living wages and 700 people die a day from poverty, that's violence. When you suppress voting rights that folks died for, and then elected officials protect violent police departments, then elected officials who protect violent police departments, that's violence. Justice is the absolute deterrent for riots and social unrest. And I like Coretta Scott King also says, I must remind you that starving a child is violence, suppressing a culture is violence, neglecting school children is violence, punishing a mother and her family is violence, discrimination against a working man is violence, ghetto housing is violence, ignoring medical need is violence, contempt for poverty is violence. So when you see, because I see this when people try to critique the violence that they see in people's comments, and the white people don't understand that. They're like, what do you mean violence? I wasn't being violent. I'm just expressing my views, my opinions, but your opinions are ultimately creating violent outcomes, or ultimately hurting people, or contributing to systems that hurt people. So it's important to understand that violence isn't just like a physical thing. All right, and I want to end this, I really like this chart, it's called the racism scale. You can actually go to, there's an activist in Maryland that created this. She actually has an updated version that was too big to actually fit on this slide. So I recommend go to this website to see the updated version, but it really does this great scale of talk of just different excuses, from, of racism, where you fall from like overt racism, like the white people are the best, white supremacists, to like subconscious racism. I'm not racist, but, and then you say a racist thing, to that denial, to like white saviorism, to like woke justifications, like there is only one race, the human race. And love, spiritual bypassing, love conquers all, to awareness. And then the idea is to kind of, find out where you're at and kind of move towards the allyship and the accomplice. Like, I will make space for people of color. Systemic racism is very real and needs to be ended. And the ultimate goal is to be accomplice, which is what I will put my safety, health, and freedom on the line to fight for people of color. I will let them lead and not try to be at the center. So that's the idea, is kind of working your way up. So I really like this. Check it out. Go to this website and check out the newest version too as well.